Welcome to Firsts in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I'm your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, the Hand of Adonai series, and Firsts in Fiction.
And I'm Alton Gansky, the author of book-length fiction and nonfiction, a whole bag full of them. And good to see everybody. I'll be handling the room tonight. So those of you in the room, say hi, and I will try to keep track of your questions.
Oh, we may have a smaller crowd because I forgot. I had too many things and I forgot to tag people on Facebook. So if you're in the chat room and you want to randomly tag all your friends and all our regular listeners in a Facebook post to remind them that we are live now, that would be great. As a reminder to those of you listening to the audio only podcast, you can watch us live 5:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time every other Tuesday, which would be 2 weeks from now. And if you're watching on YouTube, go ahead and click that thumbs up button and subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you can get some reminders whenever we publish something new. And let's see, promote us to all your friends, send us money. We don't have any way to take it, but we'll take checks. So what else am I missing? Oh, you're probably noticing a new face down in the bottom right. That would be world famous YA author Tessa Emily Hall. Tessa, how are you?
Good. I'm doing great.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm really excited. You and I have been talking at length over the last few months since we saw each other in May at Blue Ridge about YA fiction, about the possibility of having you on. You might be as busy as I am, which is quite an accomplishment. Yeah. So why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, if you don't mind?
Yeah, so I write fiction and nonfiction for teenagers. And I'm also the YA acquisitions editor for Illuminate, which is the teen imprint of Lighthouse Publishing of the Carolinas. And I also am an associate agent for Kyle Young at Heartline Literary Agency.
So agent, editor, novelist, author. So that's
right. Well, yeah.
That's all you do is just those four things?
Well, I do have Pursue Magazine, which is a Christian magazine for teenagers. So just on the side. And I work with people so they can help me, with some of the responsibilities.
Okay. I was kind of teasing because it sounds like very busy. I'm curious now. You've been an agent, an editor, and a writer. Which of the three do you prefer? If you don't mind, I know this isn't our main topic, but I think it's really interesting. It's not often. Sometimes you'll see an author agent. Sometimes you'll see an agent editor. Sometimes you'll see an author editor. I've been an author and an editor. I've never been an agent. What kind of prompted you to go into that? What do you like better? Is it the writing or the agenting or what?
Yeah, well, I didn't really plan on that. I definitely feel more called to as a writer. I've just always enjoyed writing and known that I've wanted to be an author someday. But whenever I was a teenager, I did have a desire to be a literary agent someday. I thought that would be like way in the future. But the door ended up opening and at a younger age. And so I started working for Kyle Young as an intern first. And then I started working, I was promoted as a junior agent and then as an associate agent. And then during that time, I was actually presented the opportunity to work for Lighthouse Publishing of the Carolinas. And so it's not something that I said I want to, be a writer and be an agent and be an editor all at the same time. It just kind of happened that way, but it's fine for me because it's not too much that I can't handle. And I go through seasons. Like I don't constantly write. I have 2 books that are actually coming out this fall, but I haven't, sat down and really focused on writing a book anytime within the past few months or so. But yeah, it's something that I really enjoy, but I love working with writers both on, in the publishing industry. And I also love working on books through writing. And yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Excellent. All right. So I'm probably going to have a few more questions about that because I am really interested in that and how specifically how that has shaped the way you read fiction and the way you write fiction, etc. So, but before we get into all that, we should probably talk about YA fiction. Can you give us a quick rundown about YA fiction, what it is, how it differs from adult fiction?
Yeah, so young adult fiction is geared towards teenagers, and it presents teenagers as they're navigating their teen years, and so as they're making decisions that will affect the course of their future, and teenagers, this is a pivotal time in their life, and stuff that they experience, it affects them really deeply, and they feel really deeply, and so young adult fiction basically wrestles what they experience, and it taps into their greatest needs and questions that they have, and it just helps them. It provides sort of an escapism for them, entertainment, and teenagers, they love to connect with the characters that they read about. They love to see themselves in their characters and to feel as if they're not alone in what it is that they're going through.
So, what would be the primary difference? Is that kind of a similar difference between YA and middle grade fiction, or because there's children's fiction, there's YA fiction, there's middle grade, there's adult. So most of our listeners are very familiar with adult fiction, and I think to a great extent they're familiar with YA fiction, or at least they're familiar with some of the more popular works that have come out of that genre. But how would you describe the differences between, say, YA and like a middle grade, or YA and a children's fiction?
Yeah, well, young adult fiction definitely wrestles some more serious, mature topics, because teenagers, that's when they're starting to get into their adult years, and they're starting to learn more about the world, and they're making choices that is really going to affect their future and who they're becoming. Middle grade fiction is more they're also experiencing some growth. They're experiencing life struggles. So you do see a lot of conflict-driven stories in middle grade, but a lot of middle grade is also mainly focused on characters who are taking adventures and that sort of thing. But young adult fiction, that's the main difference that I think, is that young adult fiction covers some pretty heavy topics, more so than middle grade fiction.
Dave in the chat room's asking whether or not YA extends all the way into like the early 20-somethings.
No,
you cap it at a younger age?
Yeah, so I would say young adult fiction, the main character typically is between the age, like upper young adult fiction. Typically, the main character is between the ages of like 16 and 18. And then you can go into new adult fiction, which is up until, the college age. And then adult fiction. And there's even adult fiction that is written from the perspective of a teenager. Some adult fiction, but most of the time it's the main character is reflecting on their teen years, and it's written in that sort of way, but that's not considered young adult fiction.
All right, so speaking as an agent, is that a category, new adult?
It used to be more popular than it is right now, and I don't work with new adult fiction. I don't have any new adult fiction clients. My main clients are young adult fiction and middle grade and children too.
It feels like that the new adult may have been a bit of a fad. I know the publishing industry very much likes to take books and put them in very specific locations on shelves. And so it's very easy to say this is YA. It's very easy to say this is adult. But I think what happened is the early adults, a lot of the novels that feature protagonists that are post high school age is what I would say. But, still college age kids, there tended to be, I think, a bit of a gap. And so for a while, I think a lot of publishers were looking at what we would call new adult fiction, which would be focused predominantly on protagonists in their college years. Is that accurate? Yeah,
so it used to be more popular than it is new adult fiction. And the main characters are in their college year series. Age range. And it follows them in their college years and that sort of thing. And I know there are some authors who are still continuing to write new adult fiction. It's just most of these tend to be like self-published books. There's editors at publishing houses. They're not too much considering new adult fiction right now.
Right. Okay. And I do want to make a quick distinction, though, that we're talking about really the age of the protagonist is what we're looking at. Now, I've heard a guideline that your target audience is your protagonist age -2. Is that kind of the guideline that you use?
I mean, people do, especially like teenagers, they tend to read up, and kids too. Um, and so I've never heard of that actually, but that could be a guideline.
That's just what I've heard. And I want to make it clear, though, that there's a difference between the age of your protagonist and the age of supporting characters. If you're writing young adult fiction, you can and very likely will have college age, perhaps friends or older brothers or sisters that are maybe away at college or going to the local junior college. Just
Right.
because it's a YA book doesn't mean that you're not going to have any college age kids around.
Right.
Right. In the same way, you're going to have adults in a young adult novel. It's not going to be just kids. The real difference is going to be the point of view character, your protagonist. Or now here's I'm going to throw you a curveball question. It's not on the notes. I hope you're ready.
All right.
What if I'm writing a novel that has, let's say, multiple perspectives, multiple points of view characters? We'll say one is 16, one is 18, and one is 22. How would you, either as an agent or editor or publisher, categorize that? Would you recommend that I change that? Is that like a red flag? What would you say?
I mean, personally, it's hard to place those kind of books because that's not, it doesn't fit into a specific place on the market. And so I would suggest that you revise the age of the main character if you're looking to be published by a traditional publisher, just because editors might reject it for that reason, or they might request that you change the ages of the characters, of the point of view characters.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, you and I have both, I'm sorry, my eye is itching. I just got off of football practice and I'm highly allergic to grass, so sometimes this happens.
Oh, no, it's not good.
People are like, "You're allergic to grass?" Yeah, you coach football?
I
Yeah.
am too. It's awful.
And I used to play too, so that was
Good,
a
yeah.
lot of fun. But you and I have both done some YA fiction. I tend to do more of the speculative, so I'll do, my primary series is fantasy. Yours is not. Yours is more, I guess, contemporary.
Yeah.
Would you say that there's the same amount of room, like in the market? Like I think when we think of YA fiction, our first thought is Hunger Games, and then when we think Divergent, and then we think Twilight, and these types of I guess dystopian novels or fantasy type novels or contemporary fantasy or magic realism, if that's what you want to call Twilight. Even the Harry Potter series started off as really a middle grade series and became a young adult toward the end there. Is there still a good thriving market for like contemporary YA? I know this is what you write in. Have you seen a big market there?
Yeah, actually, I would say the two biggest markets or genres in young adult fiction is contemporary and fantasy. That just seems to be what most editors are looking for at publishing houses, specifically even issue-driven contemporary fiction. Because I think teenagers, they enjoy the escapism of entering into, a fantasy world. And they also love to be able to find a connection in the characters in contemporary books. They love to be able to relate with them. And again, like reading those kind of books, it helps them to be able to navigate their own teen years. And so, yeah, there definitely is a market for contemporary. And I think that and fantasy is probably the two most popular subgenres.
Yeah. I'm thinking of John Green specifically, who seems to have had a lot of commercial success in that particular genre. And he's not alone. There's a lot of other ones that you're probably more familiar with them than am I, but John Green's is a name that pops up a lot among my high school students. And I would say he's probably more read. His novels are probably read more in my classes than Hunger Games or Divergent or something. That's just like those, but he just seems to be very popular, especially among female readers, I've noticed.
Yeah, that says a lot too about him as an author. I know he has an amazing ability at connecting with his teen readers through marketing and through writing. That's personally what I love about his books is I'm not a huge fan of his books just because I'm not a fan of some of the content that he writes
Mhm.
about.
Mhm.
But he's a great example of someone who can accurately, reflect the youth culture and connect with teenagers and reflect the voice and the angst and the emotions and the issues. And also, he presents some serious topics and issues, but he's also able to weave in some humor, which that's
Mm.
what I love about him too. So
I like that he's humorous, but he's also very literate. And I read oh goodness, The Fault in Our Stars, and he's
yeah.
making Shakespearean allusions and allusions to Kurt Vonnegut Jr., which
Mm.
obviously wins a lot of points in my book.
Mm.
That's when I first became familiar with his work and kind of kept an eye on him as a writer. Yes, there is a content warning, but I do want to talk about that real quick because you write in the Christian market. The Christian market is what I typically write in as well. It's not what I exclusively read, but you've already mentioned several times the angst of the teenagers or the life issues that they're facing, and in working with kids, I do notice that one of the hallmarks is just even remembering when I was a kid, which was like 2 weeks ago. It feels like everything's dialed, like the emotions feel like they're all dialed up to 11. Um,
Mhm.
what,
Yeah.
yeah, how do you handle that in such a way where um, the question is always, well, is it realistic if I portray, kids who don't cuss? Is it realistic if I portray kids who are, um, I guess abstinent? Is it
Mm.
realistic if all the kids are cursing and swearing and promiscuous and all that kind of stuff? And that's the world we live
Yeah.
in. What would you say to somebody who kind of has that particular viewpoint?
Yeah. So not to include that kind of stuff is not realistic. Because in teenagers, they're not going to be interested in reading those kind of stories because they want to be able to identify and they want to find someone who can help them navigate these sort of issues. But you can do so in a way that doesn't promote this stuff. So the way that I always tell people to do this is they can tell it without showing it. So they can tell that the character, said a cuss word or whatever without actually showing it. And what I especially love to write inspirational stories for teenagers, but ones that are authentic to what they go through. And I just know there's so many books out there, contemporary young adult fiction books that are accurate portrayal of the teen culture, but they're doing it in a way that promotes that kind of lifestyle, and that's just not something that I personally want to write or represent.
I think part of the difference is if you ignore it, it doesn't feel realistic. But if you glorify it, it also doesn't feel realistic. I've read particular books where everything revolves around a certain physical intimacy, and that's like the whole point of the novel, and it doesn't feel accurate at times.
Mhm.
It might be accurate for one, but I don't think it's necessarily inaccurate for everyone. And so I think the key, as you say, is maybe to find some balance, not necessarily to ignore it, also not to glorify it. You don't want it to be gratuitous. So that might be one strategy there.
Yeah.
Uh, I do have a follow-up question. I guess maybe I feel like I'm going a little bit backward in our conversation here, but
Mhm.
talking about the differences between adult fiction and YA, et cetera. I'm
Mhm.
thinking of particular books, The Color Purple, um, Ender's Game, and The Lovely Bones, all of which feature protagonists who are either YA age, teenagers, or even middle age um, children. Ender's Game,
Yeah.
I believe Ender is like 6 years old or something to that effect. I would never allow my children to read these books. Even
Mhm.
something like The Lord of the Flies features, junior high boys. I'm not sure junior high boys should be reading Lord of the Flies.
Mhm.
What would you say about those types of novels? They do have those young protagonists, but the subject matter that they deal with seems to be far more adult. Like, what's your take on those?
I think it just has to do with the parents of those kids, what their opinion is. I think it's important, that parents can read and review the books that their kids are reading especially ones that do tackle serious subject matters like that. I just think it's up to the parents, really.
Okay. All right. Excellent. So you have been an editor and an agent and a writer. So which one do you like best? Which hat do you prefer?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've always been a writer. So I feel like that's just a part of me, and that I'll never stop writing because I feel like that's what I've been called to do. And so I definitely do enjoy writing, probably more than the others, but I do love working in the book industry. I love helping other authors be able to achieve their, their publication dreams, and just being part of that process from getting books in the hands of readers. And just working with writers too. I enjoy all of it. It's really hard. Like, it's not hard for me to balance everything, but it's hard for me to just choose one, to only stick with one. It's like, I really like all of it for different reasons.
Okay, excellent. Now, my next question would be, I'm sorry, I'm trying to go off the notes, but I'm also have some other questions. You actually wrote you were 16 when you wrote your first novel, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
So you've been a teen writer, and now you're an adult writer, but still writing kind of YA stuff. We do have a good number of young listeners. So what's your advice to them? A lot of them feel like they can't write yet. They don't know. They don't think they're good enough. They think they have to be, 27 before they can write a YA book. What would you say to those who are young and looking to kind of break in and maybe write some YA fiction?
Yeah, I love encouraging young writers. I actually have a blog that's completely geared for young writers because I think it's important to use your teen years wisely, to go ahead, because publishing is such a long journey. And so it's wise to go ahead and take steps towards publication if that's something that you see yourself doing. In taking steps, by that, I don't mean actually sending out your book. You can do that if you feel like you're ready. But by that, I mean like really understanding how the industry works and, researching the craft, which is great that you're listening to this podcast, because I always tell people, educate yourself in the field. Listen to podcasts, read books, read blogs on the industry and the craft, and even try to find conferences. If there's, a small conference that's nearby that you could go to, or a bigger one. That's how it actually started for me. When I was 16, I went to Blue Ridge Mountain Christian Writers Conference and ended up meeting my publisher there. And so, yeah, I just advise getting your feet wet in the industry and treating writing as if it's a priority, not just a hobby. Set goals for yourself and treat it as if it's important, and carve out time during the week or on a specific day of the week that is just dedicated toward writing, and immerse yourself in the genre that you write as well. Just read as many books in the genre that you write as you can get your hands on. So those are the three things. I always tell people: read, research, and write.
We have I think, an interesting question coming out of the room, which, by the way, we lovingly call the romper room. I imagine you're too young to know what romper room is, but we old folks know what it is anyway. And the question is this: how do you? And this goes back to what you were saying when you're talking about the author who has elements in the story that you don't necessarily like, or condones things that you don't agree. But I think stemming from that, someone is asking, who was this? This was Lisa Lawson, I believe, was asked this: how do you handle writing for a teen audience without it sounding preachy? Is that something you have to deal with?
Yeah, definitely. And that was a struggle for me whenever I wrote my first book, Purple Moon. I wrote it, and it's a Christian novel, and I had a best-selling author look over it, and she told me that there were just parts of it that was a little too preachy. So I always tell people to let weave the message into the story, but don't write the book in order to give a lesson or preach something. Just let it come through the story and show it. Don't tell whatever it is that you're trying to tell, the message. Don't tell it, but show it through the journey that your protagonist takes, instead of giving all these scriptures and having the character learn her lesson and choices that she makes and that sort of thing. Just let the protagonist go experience their journey, and then the reader will pick up on the message on the certain theme that you have and that sort of thing. But I think it really has to do with showing instead of telling. And if you're a writer, then you know what that is.
That's actually good advice for any age that you're writing for. Being preachy is a sure way to lose readers, but that doesn't mean you can't have some message behind it. And isn't it true that early on, and maybe for the longest time, that things written for teens from children on up was somewhat moralistic in the approach that was part of the purpose of the writing? Has that gone by the wayside?
Wait, say that again?
Okay, so many books, especially if you read older YA books, you know, the Hardy Boys and, you know, Nancy Drew, and they're all showing smart but kind kids or teenagers and the like. Has that gone by the wayside?
That's a good question. I've never really thought about that, but that's really true. It does seem like the characters in young adult fiction have a lot more issues than they used to. And maybe that's just because how the teen culture has changed so much. It just shows how much has changed and how teenagers are different too.
I wonder if some of that has to do with the market, though, because if we think about publishing at that time, parents are probably buying books for their kids. And though parents are probably still buying books for their kids, I think it's somewhat reflective of our culture and what parents consider to be okay. If you look at Leave It to Beaver, even something like the Brady Bunch in that time period, those types of sitcoms and stuff that were very popular, kind of championing, you know, family values and these types of things. It seems to be more popular amongst our culture now to be quote unquote edgy. And to really kind of not shy away from hard-hitting issues. And we're definitely a society that loves conflict. And so, and you know as well as I do that when we're talking about fiction, we're talking about conflict. Ramp it up, give us more conflict. And so I think the tendency now for writers is to really focus more on the conflict, the interior conflict, because, you know, Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew, you know, maybe they've got bad guys on the outside, but their, you know, resolve and their resiliency is what, you know, champions them and how they, you know, eventually overcome. Whereas I think our contemporary audience looks for character growth, which I think is a trend in all fiction, not necessarily just adult fiction or YA fiction, but I would say it's more prevalent in YA fiction these days. And adult fiction. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. And I think literary fiction is more laid back in that kind of sense. But definitely, you know, that you have to have the character growth and the conflict and the tension. And otherwise, readers are going to lose their attention spans. And that could just be because, you know, of short YouTube videos and movies and TV. But even on like TV shows, there has to be that conflict drama in order to keep viewers interested and engaged.
You know, this kind of harkens back to a conversation that I had with one of my students. We were talking about American literary movements and moving from, you know, the age of faith to the age of reason to romanticism to, you know, dark Gothic literature to realism to modernism, blah, blah, blah. And the question was, what literary movement are we in today? And I was like, I don't know, all of them. Like publishing is it's such a large market now that there are hundreds of thousands of things being published every year. And so a lot of different literary ideas and philosophies are kind of carried throughout that. But it feels like the main thrust now that we're having this conversation is this interior struggle. And especially in Hollywood, we talk about character growth, the character arc, the character has to have an epiphany. The character has to learn something. The character has to overcome some sort of tortured past. We're so big about marrying the internal conflict and having it mirror an external conflict. That seems to be the real drive, the real formula of popular fiction these days. Maybe not necessarily literary fiction, but in literary fiction, it's definitely a focus on the interior struggle. Is that something you see in the market as well?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and in books, you know, you're supposed to pull the external arc that the character goes through based on the internal arc. That's how I actually approach writing my books too. So I definitely think that's true.
Wow.
The only thing I would add to this, before I let you get back to the interview portion of this, is that I've long taught that one of the differences between fiction and nonfiction is nonfiction is primarily education. Fiction is experience. So when the reader comes to nonfiction, they're learning something, they're absorbing information. When they come to fiction, they see things, they get to experience things through the eyes of different characters, through different events that would probably never occur to them. And in that sense, they can learn good and bad from the characters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's also what teenagers love. They love to have that experience where they can feel almost as if they are the character. They love it whenever writers can write in a way that's like deep POV rather than shallow POV, which I think is also why first person and present tense is so popular amongst young adult fiction too, because that makes it easier for writers to write this way and to really connect with teenagers and to give them that kind of fictive dream kind of experience, which is what they love.
And Dave has deep concerns about his next career. He's wondering if at the age of 62, if he's young enough to write YA fiction or if he's old enough to write YA fiction. So
I don't think there's an age limit.
62, I don't know. I feel like he might need a little more life experience before he can adequately write about being a teenager. At 62, he just hasn't even started to live yet. So definitely needs to develop that. Yeah, like you said, there's really not an age limit. I don't know how old John Green is. Maybe we shouldn't mention it. Suzanne Collins is not exactly a spring chicken. I mean, they're not old. The Divergent series.
Divergent, she's young. Veronica Roth,
she's fairly young. Stephanie Myers, I'm not sure, but Suzanne, yeah.
I always just recommend that people get teenagers to read over what they write and just ask for their feedback and hang around teenagers just so you can reflect the way that they talk and accurately portray what their world is, and then just immerse yourself in the genre. But I definitely don't think that you ever get too old to write young adult fiction.
Agreed. Yeah.
Well, we need to remember C.S. Lewis, who did, in fact, most of his books is fiction. I should say, was geared for young people, older children and teenagers. So Narnia, Out of a Silent Planet, stuff like that were really written for younger people. But he was not young when he was writing it.
That's true. Yeah, and even he wrote Narnia. Was that middle grade series? I believe that was middle grade.
Well, I think at the time that he was writing, which would have been, was it right after World War II that he wrote those? With that, I don't think they divided it up as we do today. It was just mostly children, and of course, children at that time, especially in England and the area, were very different. They'd been through so much. They'd been sent away from their families out to the countries to avoid being bombed and things like that. And that kind of twists the mind a little bit. But he was, of course, very spiritual in his writing. That's one of the things he's trying to get across to them with that. So he was trying to meet a need that way as he perceived it. But nonetheless, some of his most famous books were written when he was, probably past middle age easily.
Huh. That's true.
Yeah. So at the risk of, I want to talk a little bit more about the craft of writing YA fiction. And we've mentioned some things, but I would probably preface this by saying that writing good fiction is our goal. And then if your fiction happens to be YA, great. If it happens to be adult, okay. If it's middle grade, all right. But I tend to think that a project should be faithful to itself. Nevertheless, we do have this genre for a particular reason. So, but can you give us a quick, brief look at what you as an editor look for in quality YA fiction? What's the hallmark of a very well-written YA fiction?
Well, I personally love stories that just lead to greater discussion in young adult fiction. So stories that present, topics that are relevant for the teen culture and makes teenagers feel less alone and helps them navigate their own life. And it's deeper. I think young adult fiction is deeper than simply entertainment. Of course, teenagers love to read books in order to be entertained. They love that, but they also read for escapism. They read to understand their world and to make sense of the world. And even I would say reading helps them shape their own opinions and judgments and worldviews. And so it's a pretty big responsibility that I think young adult fiction authors have. And I think it's a great opportunity to cover some pretty heavy themes or topics and just to spark discussion and to invite teenagers to sort of reflect on what's presented in the book. So that's really what I look for is just stories that have depth to them and are a realistic portrayal of what teenagers are going through, and stories that answer their life questions and just sweep them in sort of that fictive dreamlike experience in a way that makes them forget about their surroundings and almost step into the scene and become the character. And I love stories that can do this again without promoting, bad lifestyles or morals, but also they can portray their world with a thread of hope. That's what I specifically look for at Illuminate, actually.
Did you say a threat of hope?
A thread of hope.
Thread.
A thread of hope.
I like the idea, threat of hope.
Yeah,
that's a good juxtaposition there.
Maybe I'll change the mission statement.
There you go, a threat of hope.
I'm glad to hear you say that, Aaron, because I had asked the room about some YA books, titles, if they could name any, and of course they started flooding me with them. And one was The Phantom Toll Booth, but in all of the stuff that I was doing, I quickly read it as The Phantom Toothbrush, which Dave tells me was written by somebody named Gumby.
Yeah, Casper was his pen name, and The Phantom Toothbrush. Okay, the thread of hope. I like that. And another thing that I heard you say, if I can paraphrase, is an opportunity to reflect, or I might even say a realistic opportunity to reflect on some of the more serious issues that are presented to teenagers. Is that accurate? Is that what you said?
Yeah, just a way for them to reflect on some of the things that were presented throughout the book and reflect on their own lives and help them with their own decision making. Because I think that teenagers do model after some behavior that they read about and that they watch in movies and stuff. So
yeah, and I think when you phrase it as like an opportunity to reflect, it kind of goes back to the earlier question of how do you write to a particular market without being preachy. I think you give an opportunity, and you present something without cramming it down your throat. So it's presented to them in a realistic fashion and they can take it or leave it. I think one thing that is important to note is that your character doesn't necessarily have to have a come to Jesus moment. If an opportunity is presented to them for them to grow, an opportunity to grow. Flannery O'Connor talks about a moment of grace in which a character has an opportunity to receive grace or to enact grace, if you will. Her characters seldom take those opportunities, but they are still present. And I think, like you say, that's an opportunity for students and teenagers to see this opportunity, to reflect on it. The choice they make is, yours or theirs. The choice the character makes might be influential to them because it's going to be in that deep POV as you mentioned.
Yeah, and just remember that, like, you're showing a story, you're a storyteller and you're not a preacher. You're just showing the story and the journey that your character takes, and the readers will get whatever they want to get out from your story, but your responsibility is just to write the best story that you can. And what I like to do just to help my readers to reflect on the topics and themes that are mentioned throughout my book, I like to write discussion questions at the end of my books that give them opportunity to sort of take what they've learned or what they're getting from the books and reflect on it and apply it to their own lives. And of course, this helps with book club discussions and that sort of thing. But that's just a good way to sort of go deeper into the themes of that are presented throughout the book.
Hmm. Hmm. Now, can we write a YA book that doesn't deal with like these hard-hitting, heavy themes? You know,
Yeah,
like
definitely.
yeah,
Yeah, I think it's great to be able to give them an opportunity to escape. They love that kind of escapism, and they love entertainment. But I also think even if you don't notice that you're doing it, like fantasy and sci-fi books, they still illustrate. That's a great way for people to illustrate, you know, different themes and messages, and yeah. So I think even stories that seem adventurous and entertaining, there's something deeper to even those kind of books.
Hmm. Excellent. So we've asked about some commonalities of good YA fiction. What are the three? I don't know if it has to be exactly three, but what are the most common traps for people who write YA fiction? You tend to see this a lot. People submit manuscripts to you, and every time you see a manuscript that makes this mistake, you kind of slap your forehead and go, "Oh, another one of these." Is there a particular trend that you've noticed that a lot of people kind of a common mistake people make?
Yeah, the first is a lot of people just assume that the youth culture is the same as it was when they were a teenager. It is very similar. Like a lot of the things that you may have gone through as a teenager is still relevant today, such as like the desire to fit in and that sort of thing. But it's also very different. And if with this, I mean, I would just advise to hang around other teenagers to see what it's really like and to read books in the market. Um, and then another thing, of course, is preaching and trying to use story as a way to teach lessons. So if you're wanting to teach and if you're wanting, you know, to teach lessons and that sort of and preach, then I would advise writing a nonfiction book. But again, just show the story and allow the reader to pick up on whatever it is that they end up picking up on or taking from the story themselves. And then also the third one is probably the biggest one. And that is that a lot of adult authors, they assume that teenagers are younger than they actually are. So a lot of the submissions that I'll receive at Illuminate, it actually sounds more like it's middle grade fiction instead of young adult fiction. So the voice is very young, and even what the characters do is just it's not an accurate portrayal of teenagers these days, and it's not how they talk, and it's not how they think, and it seems like they talk down on them a little bit. And so those are the three main things that I've personally seen.
Yeah, I would agree. And the books that are preachy, this is for any level of fiction, you know, adult or not new adult or young adult, but that are preachy, not necessarily with a gospel message, but like
Yeah.
this is the way you should behave and those types of things. Definitely come across as being disingenuous and heavy-handed, and like you say, there's a place for that maybe in nonfiction, but not in fiction.
Yeah.
And you're right about people struggling on getting the voice right for teenagers. It's tough, and I think there may have been a question in the chat room about how can you. I teach high school, so I'm with teenagers every day, and it's very easy for me to slide them a few pages and say, "Is this how it would go down?" Not everybody does. How then do you stay relevant with what teenagers are doing these days? How do you make sure that you're being accurate? You say this is like a big deal. How do you know that you're writing a character in a believable way if you're not interacting with teens on a regular basis?
Well, try to, you know, get around them, try to interact with them to understand what it is that they're interested in, how they talk. And also, again, read books that they read books in the young adult fiction genre, and watch movies that they're interested in. And I would even try to find a couple of teenagers who can act as beta readers for your stories. So as a teenager, I loved the Christy Miller series, which was written by Robin Jones Gunn. And she actually started writing the Christy Miller series while she was working with her church's youth group. And as she wrote it, she would allow some of the girls in her youth group to read over it, and their feedback actually shaped the course of the story, and they would tell her if something sounded too cheesy and that sort of thing. So I think it is important to have that kind of feedback, so you can, especially since teenagers are your target audience. And so it's nice to hear if it's meeting them well, like if they're taking it the right way, or if something is coming across as preachy or cheesy, or yeah. So I would just say to try to interact with them and be involved in some way, and have some teenagers look over your stuff and just know what it is what they're interested in.
So before I get to some rapid fire questions, I'm curious if you've noticed a trend, any sort of cliches or something that have been popping up, perhaps a cliche story structure where the character is always trying to do whatever, or do you feel like the dystopian thing has been done too much? Is that getting to be cliche? What kind of like negative trends have you seen in YA fiction?
Well, definitely dystopian. I love dystopian. I really love dystopian, but that is starting to be overdone. And a lot of editors at publishing houses are just saying no automatically to dystopian fiction, unfortunately. And then, of course, love triangles will always be a cliche. Let's see. Those are the only two that I can think of actually right now. And also just weak protagonists. Teenagers, even though it's important to have flawed characters and flawed main characters, you don't want them to be so flawed that they're weak. You need to have, strong characters, and especially characters who can grow throughout the course of the story.
We've got to have a means of development. So they should be weak in one area and perhaps strong in another, giving them some sort of strength or ability, something that's unique about them that's going to make the readers want to follow them. So I do have a dystopian novel with a love triangle in it. Can I pitch that to you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, sweet. I love dystopian. Seriously though, I love dystopian fiction, and I don't know about the love triangle though, but I'll consider dystopian for Illuminate, just not the Heartline, because that's not what editors want to see.
She can say no to you like she can anyone else, Aaron. So
yeah, that's true. How about a love pentagon or a love? I'm trying to maybe octagon. Wait,
I think that's a little bit too much.
Too much. Okay. I'm teasing, of course, but so, all right. Rapid fire questions. And this might just be a quick list before we get to any unanswered questions that are hovering around the chat room. So if you are in the chat room and you've got quick questions for Tessa or for Pops or for myself, make sure you kind of get those in there real quick. I'm curious who you think are some of the best YA fiction writers, and what are some of the best examples of YA fiction that you've read? That these are like the exemplar books. These are the novels that that our listeners should be reading if they want to get a good taste of what it is to write a quality YA fiction novel.
Okay, so for me personally, I love inspirational young adult fiction. So I read mostly inspirational fiction. So most of my authors, my favorite authors come from there. And so these would include like Cindy Coloma. I love her books. And Jenny B. Jones, not to be confused with Junie B. Jones. And Stephanie Morrill, she writes in both the Christian markets and the secular market. And also Nicole Quigley, I love her. And then in the general markets, I love, of course, Suzanne Collins and Veronica Roth, Lauren Oliver, and I love what John Green is doing and how he's able to, write young adult fiction and connect with teenagers. And I love his voice, but I'm not a huge fan of some of the content in his books, so. But other than that.
I would agree with that. A friend of mine, Anna Shinoda, has also written a book called Learning Not to Drown. Have I already talked to you about that one, Tessa?
I don't think so.
That one might really be up your alley. So Yeah, high school friend of mine. We were in the same honors English class. So
Huh.
our honors English teacher has 2 published authors in his class. So I
Oh,
suppose
cool.
good on him. But yeah, Learning Not to Drown by Anna Shinoda is also real good. I also enjoyed the Hunger Games series.
I love
Twilight, everybody knows, was my
I
favorite.
wasn't crazy about
Um,
Twilight.
that was a lot of sarcasm. It was really hard to say that with a straight face. Not a huge Twilight fan, but John Green, like I say, I really enjoyed The Fault in Our Stars, but again, like you said, the content, not a huge fan of that.
Mhm.
So those are the names that kind of leap off the page, the figurative page for me. Yeah. So, Pops, how about you? What's your favorite YA book?
My favorite YA book.
Mm-hmm.
I don't read much YA anymore. Not being a
Not your son.
YA or anywhere near. Oh, especially my sons. No, that's true. I've read his, but I do have very fond memories of reading books written towards someone my age when I was a teenager, and in fact, that's what really got me into reading and thinking about being a writer. And so, I cleaned out the library on those. So it does make a very important impact on that. And, while we were talking about not being preachy, I just want to make sure people don't misunderstand us. There's a difference between being preachy and exemplifying something through the actions, both good and bad, showing the outcomes of some of those things. So there's nothing wrong with having some moral to it, but not a sermon. Let your protagonists make mistakes. Let them make bad decisions if you want to show the results of making bad decisions, but do be realistic with it. So Dave does have a question while I'm talking now. So he wants to know, why does there seem to be so much more YA speculative fiction than adult speculative fiction?
That's true. I'm not sure why that is, but I think that's true.
You think it's an age kind of thing? Because I know even as a young adult, the things I really enjoyed reading most were science fiction. I don't read much science fiction now. So do you think that young people may be thinking towards the future, liking technology, all those kinds of things, that would get very interested in at those ages, get into that, and then later fall off?
Maybe they're more imaginative.
Maybe.
I feel like I feel like the speculative market transcends age in a lot of ways. If you're a speculative writer or reader, rather, you'll probably be a speculative reader your whole life. If you fall in love with The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, you'll probably continue to read fantasy well until you're an adult, and continue to read fantasies that are geared toward young adults, that feature young protagonists. Fantasy, as a general rule, well, maybe not a general rule, many fantasy novels and series feature young protagonists. There are some archetypes that they draw from: the young hero from the province, kind of the Star Wars type of a story, the hero's journey, all of that. And that usually will feature a young protagonist to kind of tell a coming of age story as well. And I think that blends really into sci-fi in a lot of ways. I think YA readers are more open to that. I think in large part, it's a lot easier to convince a kid to read Ender's Game than it is to convince them to read Shakespeare. When you're in English class and you've got to read The Crucible, and you've got to read, all these high-level literary books, anything by Shakespeare, that's just Beowulf, it's rough. And so I think when those kids go home, it's nice for them to be able to pick up something that is clearly not that.
I remember reading Beowulf in freshman year of college. Man, that's rough going.
Yeah. Why isn't this in English?
But the other thing about you were talking about the Orson Scott Card's book, Ender's Game, and some of the others, he's also a masterful writer. He could be anybody's mentor. But he also writes adult stuff too, so old people stuff. Of course, he's an old guy now, so.
And at the risk of hijacking the podcast and making it into a speculative conversation, I think that the speculative market has some of the greatest writers. Not to say that all great writers write speculative, but I think a lot of people tend to discount the quality of a novel because it's in the speculative market. Whereas I would take Ender's Game and hold that up against almost any other literary work, just in the quality of the craft and the thematic elements that it plays with. And just because it takes place on a space station doesn't mean that it's not relevant, culturally relevant. It doesn't mean that it's not, I guess, emotionally relevant, especially to its readers. So now, that being said, there are some real stinkers out there as well. The speculative market, like many others, has been there's an influx of not quality writing, just like all other markets. But for whatever reason, I think young readers like the escapism, as you've said, Tessa, and that's very apparent in speculative works. So,
and would you consider your books to be speculative?
Yes. The Hand of Adonai series is a portal fiction, portal fantasy. And so it is fantasy in that regard. It is speculative in that regard, but it's features contemporary teenagers. So I feel like it still has that contemporary kind of coming of age type feel.
Yeah, that's sort of what I've found in a lot of speculative books, is kind of has contemporary, it is contemporary, but then there's some fantastical elements that are incorporated, sort of like Narnia, Chronicles of Narnia.
That's actually how I pitch the book. Is
Tron,
really? Yeah, I always say it's Tron meets Narnia. So
cool. I love that.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. So
just for those who might be listening even later, because we know people watch this on YouTube and other places, we probably ought to define what we mean by speculative. I never like to assume everybody knows all the terms. And speculative is what we used to call sci-fi, but it's been broadened. So it's not pure sci-fi. It's anything has a speculation in it, such as Aaron's book, which is describing as a portal book going to a different land. So it can be fantasy. So it's kind of a fairly new genre title. And so science fiction has been lumped in it. And for the longest time, bookstores would do this. They'd lump fantasy and science fiction together, and they're nothing alike. But they always assume that, people who read that read both. They don't. But speculative is a bigger umbrella. At least that's my take on it.
And sometimes it could have supernatural elements too. I would say.
Well, most of my early books, because I was doing, and back then we'd call it supernatural suspense, because we got the supernatural term in there. But then I would also write a lot of things, and I would be introduced on radio shows and the like as a science fiction writer. And I've never written science fiction. I love science fiction, but I've never written science fiction. I've had a technical aspect. So Michael Crichton, for example, has a lot of technical stuff in some of his books, but he's not a science fiction. He was not, I should say. We lost him a few years ago, but he was never a science fiction writer. In that sense, maybe Prey could be called science fiction, but mostly it's I call it techno fiction.
You know the difference between fantasy and science fiction. In science fiction, the magic wand has batteries.
I like that. It's good.
I made that one up myself. Yeah, but I think there's a lot of truth in that. There's some great similarities, but in science fiction, you use technology to explain the strange and unusual. In supernatural, it's the same thing. The magic wand is a ghost. I mean, if you want to continue that kind of thought line. So, but yeah, there are a lot of commonalities, and it's the strange and unexplained, and it just depends on whether you attribute it to some sort of supernatural force or some sort of alien force or some sort of fantasy force. So, or you could do like Star Wars and do the force. When, the lightsaber has batteries. Still a fantasy, but it's got batteries, right? So,
or you can blend them. What was it? Amish vampires from space.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and don't let the title fool you. I had to read it because I was judging a contest, and I kept putting it off. I thought this guy's not serious. He's joking around. He's having fun. Of a craft I take so seriously. It was a great book. It was a great book. It was well written, and it's far more interesting than you would think. But this whole idea of Amish vampires in space sounds so ridiculous, but nonetheless, it kind of worked. And then somebody just asked the question, what is a sonic screwdriver? That's a Doctor Who reference, of course. But then what is Doctor Who? Is that science fiction? Is that fantasy? Is it speculative?
I would be more inclined to answer that if I'd ever watched the show.
Yeah, me too.
I'm losing so much nerd cred right now.
Oh man. Oh, well, I'm done.
Star Trek. I'll talk Star Trek all day. I'll talk Star Wars all day. I'll talk Lord of the Rings. I'll talk Marvel. I'll talk DC. But Doctor Who is. I know the chat room is so mad at me right now. I'm gonna learn.
We gotta work on your education. I always thought you were an educated man. You got a master's degree, fine arts, but I don't know.
Well, the term there is fine arts.
Just skip all the ones with the first Doctor, unless you're doing it for historical research, because it was pretty bad. That, by the way, as famous as it is now, started off as a program for children. It was a children's program. Mm-hmm. It was a short program. Had one of the first female directors, at least in England, that did it. And of course, it had no budget, and that's why the first Doctor Who series is so. Oh, what's the literary term? Lame. They all did a great job, the best they could for the situation, but they were writing for children, and it's paced like that. And then in the modern, which goes back, a good number of years, when it was rebooted, it was an entirely different thing. It wasn't for children; it was for adults.
Huh.
Very interesting. Probably for adults who watched it as children. So,
yeah.
Well, it is 6:30. Tessa, thank you so much for joining us. I thought this was really, really great. So,
yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Our show notes today were just a list of questions, so I probably will not be posting actual show notes tomorrow on my website, but I will post the audio and the video for you. If you're looking for that. So those of you who listen to the audio, you'll still get it on time, but you just won't be able to access the show notes. If you are curious and you'd like to know more about YA fiction and Tessa Emily Hall, Tessa, where can they find you?
Yeah, so basically they can go to my website, tessaemilyhall.com, and also all over social media. So Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, I am Tessa Emily Hall. So yeah, it's pretty straightforward.
All right. And as always, you can find Pops at altongansky.com. You can find me at aarongansky.com. We'll be back in 2 more weeks with, I believe, another gross anatomy of a novel. So we'll continue that series then. So thank you all so much for listening. And until next week, good writing.